The heat rising from the asphalt shimmered, distorting the crisp lines of the dress blue uniforms and the polished chrome of the ceremonial vehicles. For Sarah Jenkins, the air, thick with the smell of diesel, patriotism, and grilled hot dogs, was a familiar kind underscore of suffocation. It was Armed Forces Day at the county fairgrounds, an annual spectacle of military might and recruitment bravado. She stood near the back of the crowd, a solitary figure in jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, her posture relaxed but her eyes missing nothing. A ghost in a world she once owned. Her service felt like a lifetime ago, a faded photograph of a different woman. Now, she was just a civilian, a footnote. A few feet away, a knot of active-duty Marines, their high and tight haircuts practically a uniform in themselves, held court. Their laughter was loud, their confidence a broadcast signal. The one with the gunnery sergeant's chevrons, a man whose jaw seemed permanently clenched around a core of self-importance, noticed her gaze. He leaned over to his corporal. "Check it out," he stage whispered, loud enough for her to hear. "Got a fangirl. Probably hoping one of us will sign her kid's hat." The younger Marine snickered. Sarah's gaze didn't waver, nor did her expression change. She had heard variations of that dismissal 1,000 times. In their eyes, she was invisible, or worse, a caricature, a dependent, a groupie, someone on the periphery of the real sacrifice. They saw her plain clothes, her lack of overt military bearing, and drew their conclusions with the swift, arrogant certainty of youth and institutional pride. The gunny, whose name-tape read Rourke, caught her eye again and gave a condescending smirk. "Something we can help you with, ma'am?" The word ma'am was a weapon, a divider. It placed her firmly on the other side of the fence. Sarah offered a small, polite shake of her head. "Just watching. Enjoying the day." Her voice was quiet, measured, carrying no hint of the storm of memories his casual disrespect had stirred. Rourke turned back to his men, satisfied. "See? Harmless." He didn't see the faint, silvery tracery of a scar that disappeared into her hairline, or the way her hands, though still, rested in a state of coiled readiness. He didn't see the ghost of a corpsman's vest on her shoulders or feel the phantom weight of a rifle in her hands. He saw a woman. He saw a civilian. He saw nothing at all. And in that moment of casual, dismissive blindness, the first gear of a terrible machine began to turn. The main event was a demonstration of maneuverability featuring a pair of light armored vehicles. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, narrating the technical specifications and combat history of the 8-wheeled behemoths. They thundered onto the cordon-off asphalt track, their engines a deep-throated growl that vibrated through the soles of Sarah's worn-out boots. Gunny Rourke and his crew puffed out their chests, nodding along as if they had personally designed the machines. "That's the 25mm Bushmaster chain gun," Rourke explained authoritatively to a wide-eyed teenager. "Can put a round through a brick wall a mile away. Real American muscle." Sarah watched the vehicles, her focus narrowed. She wasn't listening to the announcer or to Rourke's recruiting pitch. She was watching the way the lead vehicle's front right wheel assembly seemed to shimmy, an almost imperceptible wobble on the straightaway. It was the kind of detail you only notice after spending hundreds of hours maintaining them in the field, after learning the unique groans and vibrations that preceded a catastrophic failure. It was a mechanic's observation, a survivor's instinct. She felt a cold prickle on her arms, a familiar premonition that tasted like copper and dust. The LAVs began their high-speed pass, a display of choreographed power. They swerved in unison, their heavy frames surprisingly agile. But as the lead vehicle banked into a hard right turn, the wobble in its wheel became a violent shudder. A high-pitched metallic screech cut through the engine roar, a sound of stressed steel giving way. Rourke and his men stopped their posturing, their expressions shifting from pride to confusion. "What was that?" one of the younger Marines asked. Rourke squinted. "Probably just kicking up some gravel." But Sarah knew better. That wasn't the sound of gravel. It was the sound of a tie rod bolt shearing. She saw the wheel assembly cant at an unnatural angle just as the driver tried to correct. The massive vehicle, now a 14-ton projectile with a failed steering mechanism, veered sharply off its designated path, its momentum carrying it directly toward a static display of historical military equipment, and the crowd of spectators standing right beside it. Panic erupted like a flash fire. A wave of screams washed over the fairgrounds as people scrambled backward, a chaotic retreat of tripping bodies and terrified shouts. The flimsy metal barricades were trampled in an instant. The out-of-control LAV, its tires screeching in a futile protest, plowed through a display of sandbagged emplacements, sending splintered wood and canvas flying like shrapnel. Gunny Rourke instinctively shoved his younger Marines back, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. His parade ground bravado evaporated, replaced by the rigid, instinctual training of a man facing an unexpected threat he had no protocol for. His mind was racing, trying to fit this civilian disaster into a combat framework, but it wouldn't fit. This wasn't an IED or an ambush. It was a mechanical failure in the middle of a crowd of families. In the chaos, a young Marine corporal, who had been manning the static display, was knocked down by the initial surge of the crowd. His leg was twisted beneath him at a horrifying angle, a shard of bone jutting through his camouflaged trousers. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of agony, as he tried to drag himself away, but his body wouldn't obey. He was exposed, helpless, directly in the path of the careening armored vehicle. The machine was only 50 yards away and closing fast, its massive bulk seeming to swell as it filled his vision. He was going to die. He squeezed his eyes shut, a prayer catching in his throat. Sarah saw it all. For her, the world suddenly snapped into a terrifying, silent clarity. The screaming crowd became a muted roar, the churning engine a distant hum. Time seemed to stretch, each heartbeat a slow, deliberate drumbeat. She saw the corporal's face, pale with shock and pain, his eyes wide with a terror she had seen a dozen times before in the dust of Fallujah and the mountains of Afghanistan. It was the face of a boy about to be consumed by the indifferent machinery of violence. She saw Rourke and his men, frozen for a fatal half-second, their training insufficient for this specific brand of horror. They were warriors, but this was a rescue, a different and more immediate calling. In that elongated moment of silence, Sarah Jenkins made a choice that wasn't a choice at all. It was an activation. The quiet civilian, the forgotten veteran, dissolved. In her place stood Corpsman Jenkins' call sign. Doc! The woman who had run into machine gun fire to pull a wounded Marine out of a kill zone, the woman who had held shattered bodies together with pressure dressings and prayer. The oath she had taken didn't come with an expiration date. Semper Fidelis wasn't just a motto for those in uniform. It was a covenant carved into her soul. Her body moved before her mind had finished processing the command. She pushed off the balls of her feet, her movements economical and explosive, a stark contrast to the panicked, flailing limbs of the crowd around her. She didn't run away from the danger, she ran directly toward it, her trajectory a perfect intercept course with the injured corporal. Rourke saw her go, a flash of gray against the chaos. "Hey! Ma'am! Get back here!" he yelled, his voice a mix of authority and disbelief. But his words were lost in the maelstrom. He watched, dumbfounded, as the quiet woman he had dismissed minutes earlier charged headlong into a situation that had paralyzed him and his trained Marines. Her face was set in a mask of absolute resolve, a look he had seen only on the faces of the most hardened combat veterans in the moments before a breach. It was a look that radiated a terrifying sense of purpose, a complete and utter disregard for her own preservation. Her destination was not a place of safety, but a person. She was a shield seeking its purpose. The intervening 20 yards were a gauntlet of flying debris. The LAV clipped a metal equipment stand, sending a spray of steel fragments and bolts through the air. The first impact was a piece of shattered asphalt, sharp and heavy, that struck Sarah high on the right shoulder. It felt like a hammer blow, a deep, radiating ache that threatened to numb her entire arm. She didn't slow. A second later, a sheared-off piece of the display tent's aluminum frame, twisted into a jagged spear, cartwheeled through the air and slammed into her left side, just below her ribs. The impact stole her breath, a white-hot flash of pain that lanced through her torso. She grunted, forcing air back into her lungs, her stride faltering for only a single step before she corrected. She was 5 yards from the corporal now. She could see the tear tracks in the dust on his cheeks. He was staring at the LAV, his body rigid with impending doom. The third hit was a length of thick electrical cable, whipped loose from a generator, that lashed across her thighs with the force of a bullwhip, leaving an immediate, burning welt. Her legs screamed in protest, but her momentum carried her forward. She reached the corporal, her shadow falling over him. "I got you, Marine," she said, her voice impossibly calm, a lifeline in the chaos. She didn't try to move him. There was no time. Instead, she spun, positioning her own body between him and the oncoming vehicle, her back to the threat. She crouched low, making herself as large a target as possible, her arms instinctively wrapping over her head and neck. The fourth impact was a cascade of hot, stinging gravel kicked up by the LAV's front tire, peppering her back and legs like a shotgun blast. The fifth was the vehicle's heavy-duty side mirror, ripped from its mounting, which hit her square in the center of her back with a sickening, solid thud. A constellation of fire exploded behind her eyes. Her vision swam, but she held her position, her muscles screaming, her entire being focused on a single, primal command: absorb it. She was a bulwark. She was a shield of flesh and bone. The sixth impact wasn't a projectile but a wave of force. The LAV's massive tire struck the edge of a concrete curb just feet from them, the impact sending a jarring shockwave through the ground that traveled up her spine and rattled her teeth. The seventh and final hit was the world turning to dirt and noise. The LAV roared past, its immense bulk missing them by inches, but the vortex it created threw up a blinding, choking cloud of dust and debris that sandblasted her exposed skin. And then silence. A profound, ringing silence as the 14-ton machine finally crashed into a distant retaining wall with a final, deafening crunch of metal. The dust began to settle, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The fairgrounds looked like a war zone. People were slowly picking themselves up, their faces masks of disbelief. And in the middle of it all, in the eye of the storm, was Sarah. She was still crouched over the injured corporal, a silent guardian covered in a thick layer of grime and dust. Her gray t-shirt was torn, revealing angry red welts and the dark, blossoming stain of bruises. A trickle of blood snaked its way down from her hairline, tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire crowd, including Gunny Rourke and his Marines, stood frozen, staring at the tableau. They had just witnessed something impossible, an act of selfless courage so pure and immediate it defied comprehension. Rourke felt a profound and sickening shame curdle in his stomach. The woman he had mocked, the harmless civilian he had dismissed, had just done what he should have done. While he was assessing, she was acting. While he was processing, she was sacrificing. He saw now. He saw the steel in her spine, the quiet, unshakable strength that had been there all along, hidden beneath a veneer of civilian anonymity. Slowly, as if coming out of a trance, Sarah pushed herself up. Every muscle screamed in protest. She ignored the fire in her ribs and the throbbing in her back and immediately knelt beside the corporal, her hands going to work with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. "Stay with me, Marine." "What's your name?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. "Miller. Corporal Miller," he gasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and awe. "Doc, you just—" Sarah's fingers were already assessing his injury, her touch gentle but firm. "Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula. We need to stabilize this and watch for shock." She looked up, her gaze sweeping the stunned faces until it landed on Rourke. There was no accusation in her eyes, no "I told you so," there was only a command. "Gunny! I need 2 tourniquets from your IFACs, now! And get a damn corpseman over here!" Her voice cut through the stunned silence like a drill instructor's command on a quiet morning. Rourke snapped to attention as if he'd been struck. The authority in her voice was absolute, forged not on a parade deck but in the crucible of real-world trauma. He and his men moved, their shock replaced by a sudden, desperate urge to follow her lead. They fumbled with their first aid kits, their hands shaking slightly as they produced the requested equipment. They were no longer the arrogant kings of the fairgrounds. They were assistants to a force of nature they had tragically, foolishly underestimated. The ambulance ride was a blur of fluorescent lights and the clipped, professional chatter of paramedics. Sarah had refused treatment for herself until Corporal Miller was stabilized and on his way to the base hospital. She sat in the waiting room, a disposable hospital blanket draped over her shoulders, wincing as she moved. Medics had cleaned the gash on her head and confirmed she had at least 2 cracked ribs and deep tissue bruising that would soon turn a spectacular shade of purple and black across most of her back and side. She was exhausted, the adrenaline having long since worn off, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache in her bones and a familiar weariness in her soul. By midnight, the story had already become a local legend. Cell phone videos, shaky and chaotic, were spreading like wildfire across social media and local news channels. The narrative was solidifying. An unidentified female veteran had shielded a downed Marine, absorbing multiple impacts from flying debris to save his life. On the nearby Marine Corps base, the story was the only topic of conversation. Eyewitness accounts from Rourke and his men, raw and humbled, filled in the details the videos couldn't capture. They spoke of her impossible calm, her immediate and decisive action, and the quiet authority with which she had taken command of the chaotic scene. Gunny Rourke, in his preliminary report to his commanding officer, had been brutally honest, not just about the event, but about his own failings. He described his earlier condescension, his dismissal of her, and the profound shame he felt when he realized who, and what, he had so arrogantly misjudged. He didn't know her name yet, but he described her with a newfound reverence, calling her the realest Marine I've seen in 10 years, sir. The base commander, a grizzled colonel who had seen enough real combat to recognize true heroism when he heard it, had listened intently. He had already put his staff to work, cross-referencing public records and witness descriptions. By morning, they had a name, Sarah Jenkins. And they had her service record. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, Fleet Marine Force. 2 combat tours. A Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with a V for Valor. A Purple Heart. The citation for her NAM was for running through enemy fire to render aid to 3 wounded Marines, successfully stabilizing them all while under direct threat. The picture was now complete. She wasn't just some veteran, she was a decorated combat medic. A doc. In the culture of the Marine Corps, there is no title held in higher esteem. The next morning, the sun streamed through the blinds of Sarah's small, tidy apartment. Every inch of her body was a symphony of pain. Moving from the bed to the kitchen to make coffee was an arduous, carefully planned operation. She felt old, tired, and a little foolish. The events of the previous day felt surreal, a violent dream she had woken up from. She was just starting to sip her coffee, wincing as the simple act of lifting the mug stretched the bruised muscles in her side, when she heard the sound. It was the unmistakable rumble of government vehicles pulling up outside her building. Peeking through the blinds, her heart sank. 2 black sedans and a Marine Corps-marked utility vehicle were parked at the curb. Several figures in immaculate dress blue uniforms were getting out. She braced herself for the inevitable, a deposition, liability questions, a bureaucratic nightmare. She was a civilian who had interfered at a military event. No matter her intentions, she knew there would be paperwork, questions, and probably a lecture about leaving things to the professionals. There was a firm, respectful knock on her door. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her aching back as much as she could, and opened it. Standing before her was a full-bird colonel, his uniform adorned with ribbons that told the story of a long and distinguished career. Flanking him were a sergeant major and, to her profound surprise, Gunny Rourke. Rourke's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor in front of him, his usual arrogance completely gone, replaced by a deep and profound humility. The colonel, a man with kind but serious eyes, removed his cover and held it under his arm. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a respectful baritone. "My name is Colonel Matthews. I'm the base commander. May we have a moment of your time?" Sarah nodded numbly, stepping aside to let them into her small living room. She gestured toward her worn sofa, but the colonel shook his head. "We won't be staying long, ma'am. We're not here to question you. We're not here for a report." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the fresh stitches on her forehead and the visible stiffness of her movements. His expression softened. "We're here to say thank you." The colonel's words hung in the quiet air of the apartment. Sarah stared at him, confused. "Thank you, sir?" "Yesterday," Colonel Matthews continued, his voice resonating with sincerity, "you embodied the very highest ideals of the United States Marine Corps. In a moment of chaos, when many trained Marines were frozen in shock, you acted. You ran toward danger, not away from it. You put yourself between one of our own and certain death." He took a step forward. "We've seen the videos. We've spoken to the witnesses. We have read your service record, Corpsman Jenkins." The use of her old title was deliberate, a bridge across the years, an acknowledgement of the identity that still lived within her. "You took 7 direct hits to shield that, Corporal." 7. The doctor said that had you not been there, Corporal Miller would not have survived. You, a civilian, upheld the warrior ethos of leave no man behind more fiercely than anyone on that field. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on the stone-faced gunnery sergeant. "Gunny Rourke has something he'd like to say." Rourke stepped forward, his movements stiff and formal. He raised his eyes to meet Sarah's for the first time, and she saw in them a raw, gut-wrenching shame. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am. Corpsman." He corrected himself, his voice thick with emotion. "Yesterday, before the accident, I was unprofessional. I was arrogant. I disrespected you. I judged you by your appearance and I was wrong. What you did, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen. You are more of a Marine than I was yesterday. I am deeply and profoundly sorry for my conduct. There is no excuse for it." He stood there, awaiting her judgment. Sarah looked at the man before her, a man whose entire world had been upended. She saw not an enemy, but a man humbled by a truth he couldn't deny. In his eyes she saw the potential for growth, for change. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Apology accepted, Gunny." The relief that washed over Rourke's face was palpable. Colonel Matthews stepped forward again, this time holding a velvet-lined presentation case. He opened it. Inside, nestled against the dark blue felt, was the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the highest non-combat decoration for heroism. "Sarah Jenkins," the colonel said, his voice now taking on the formal cadence of a citation. "For conspicuous heroism at the risk of your own life, you shielded a fellow service member from grievous harm. Your selfless actions, your unwavering courage, and your profound sense of duty, long after your active service has ended, are in keeping with the finest traditions of the naval service. The Secretary of the Navy has personally approved this award. You are, and always will be, one of us. Semper Fidelis, Doc." He carefully pinned the medal to her simple gray t-shirt. As he stepped back and rendered a slow, perfect salute, followed by the sergeant major and a teary-eyed Gunny Rourke, Sarah Jenkins finally understood. The pain in her body was temporary. The scars, new and old, were just markers of a journey. But the honor, the recognition, the quiet, powerful justice of this moment, that was forever. She was not a ghost. She was not a footnote. She was a hero, finally seen.